No one had seen her sneak down to the officers' deck one Sunday night. She'd crept down after prayers given by the captain to all his men and had been able to leave quite quickly as she was near the quarter-deck. It was James's turn for the limes, so once she had been given her ration and had quickly given them to him, Cicely decided to forego supper, choosing to allow Heald, Nigel's other accomplice, to pursue her across the mess, where he was waylaid by Woolley, who engaged him in conversation. She was sure it was getting worse. James mentioned in passing, when they swapped shifts, that Powder Boys were talking about similar acts of thievery, which had caused her to feel indignant. But she put it to the back of her mind now as she approached the door. Shafts of grey light outlined the door in the failing light, and the stench of rotten meat wafted along the corridor. What she had been the worst now was the sheer amount of energy needed to carry out such a demanding job. It wasn't surprising the captain cared about their well-being and strength, for he needed as much brawn and muscle to carry out the jobs that a lad like her, like Robert Young, would be a poor return for his valuable food ration. Which is why she was creeping carefully towards the doctor's cabin. If she was caught, she reasoned, she could just say she was looking for him, that she had toothache. No sailor would invent such a tale as the removal of a tooth. Like everything here was crude and brutal. Cicely put her hand on the cabin handle, twisting the iron latch at the center and leaning on the oak. It opened easily and she scurried in, closing the door behind her and standing with her back to it. Her eye caught the chest in which the doctor had pulled the bottle of laudanum a week ago, which had made her drowsy and taken away every last ache. She looked at the bottle momentarily before putting its squat neck to her lips, taking a small sip and dampening her lips. Cicely had heard many horror stories about the medicine, and she knew it could be like grog. It made you want it and need it. Since she had been given it by the doctor 3 weeks ago, she had resolved determinedly that she would not think of its relieving effects. However, following their arduous toil in the hot sun as well as the captain's insistence they mastered the ropes, the thought of her aches melting away had decided for her. Cicely looked around the cabin momentarily. The doctor was astute, she knew, and would realize something had gone, so she replaced the bottle back in the chest, making sure she replaced the cork ineffectively, so some of its contents would leak. Placing the trunk back down on the wooden planks, Cicely froze as she heard footsteps above her. The ship's crew had finished suppering, she realized, so the night crew were about to begin their shift and day to retire to the crew deck. Just as she was about to open the doctor's door, she heard voices which were getting louder. Someone was coming this way. "I realize the significance of your course of action, Jack," she heard the doctor say, "but I really do believe you should consider the effects upon. If they find me in here," Cicely's mind raced, "I'll say yes. Toothache. They would take pity on the humble illiterate thing like Robert Young, and I would vow never to repeat the transgression. We need to take on supplies. There is no two ways about it. And the men? If you are implying, Stephen, that I would deliberately endanger the crew. Not in the least. However, it is my opinion that you should release from the service that which would not suit your purpose. Then I am wholeheartedly behind you." Cicely looked at the door latch, and saw it moving down. She held her breath as the two men continued to converse. "This evening then," she heard the doctor say. "Allow me to leave this in my cabin, and I shall be to the foredeck immediately." In the darkness, Cicely's heart sank. He was going to ask what she was doing there, maybe even smell the foul medicinal liquid. The door opened, and she huddled behind it as Stephen Maturin, dressed in his day wear, strode in and lay a pile of papers and a bag on the desk, before turning round. Cicely looked down, her heart thumping in her chest. She was just about to speak when she felt the door next to her close as the doctor made his way out. He hadn't seen her. The dread within changed immediately to elation as she heard his footsteps retreat along the corridor. That was far too close, she thought as she herself stepped out, and made her way towards the crew deck above, vowing to herself she would never do it again. Minutes later she was sitting amongst the salts, swigging their grog ration and endeavoring to rest before their next shift began. They sat in groups under the stars, on rails and stairs, cross-legged on planks or leaning by the railings. She sat next but one to old Joe, a sailor nearly 50 years old, and as the night breezes swept over the deck he described the surgery he had just received from the doctor. 15 stitches, right enough, he told her, pointing towards his forearm. On a lanyard spike near the stern. Took him a minute a stitch, young, he added, looking down and giving her a nudge. And this air, he held up his chin to show Cicely scars running from his chin down his throat, was when I were cleaning the larboard side of the ship when the rope caught round me neck. So I reckon you should stick with a screw on the surprise air, so that when you first come for a Burton, you'll have the best surgeon in His Majesty's Navy to look after you. Yes, sir, said Cicely meekly. She had learned too that older sailors preferred to feel as if they were giving advice, so she took it with grace and decided not to argue. As it was, a little thought reminded her as she glanced across to the group of sailors where Nigel was sitting. She had already come for a Burton and the doctor had looked after her. However, if what she had heard the captain saying was correct and they needed to get supplies that they may be docking soon, she could approach Edward and they could desert the ship together. Said Chell, joining Joe and Cicely. He's not showing you his battle wounds, is he? Cicely looked at Joe. He means me battles with the ship, laughed Joe heartily. Never have I had as much trouble aboard here as any others. Been in more trouble with this lady's surprise than any other lady, wooden or otherwise. He laughed again, and Chell, a foremast hand, joined him. 'Tis my fortune to have served with the captain most me life though, continued Joe, and we seen many a war together. Cicely smiled. She knew where this was heading. Like many sailors Joe's age, sailors liked to tell their tales of adventure, bravery and courage, so she anticipated the tale that was to come. And was nearly taken aback when he revealed the name of the hero of the story who had sailed with this man with 2 others who were salts under Lucky Jack's first command. The Harriet had jumped ship and taken a rowing boat to Cadiz. They spent 3 days dressing as Spaniards, in an effort to convince the French authorities that although they were English, they were Catholics wishing to fight for Napoleon. Their disguise completely took in the French, who gave them in return for their honor the exact specifications and number of the French Navy in the port, which they then took back to Captain Aubrey. With the information, he was able to hold a small portion of the port with other naval vessels before Nelson's fleet entered and successfully passed through the Straits of Gibraltar. It would seem that without this, the Victory would never have made it to the north coast of Egypt to fight the Battle of the Nile, with which the Harriet, under Aubrey, fought successfully. But Cicely's heart was still racing when she heard the name. The Frenchman who had passed on the information had done so to John Fotherington. Surely it must be the same man who helped her gain acceptance aboard the Surprise almost a month ago. And despite all that, he was too old now to be acceptable to serve. 3 cheers for Lucky Jack and his crew, cheered Dan Cooper, who had also sidled over to hear the story. "Aye," called another man. 3 cheers for the captain. Cicely joined the cheer too, feeling proud to have met John Fotherington. She spent the next hour listening to the stories of the men as the evening wore on, joining in a chorus or 2 of London bells a-calling and watching a couple of them tell a story using a worn set of playing cards, showing how it could also be thought of as the Bible, with 4 apostles, 52 books and so on. Gambling was forbidden aboard on a Sunday. This gave her time to decide how to approach Edward and tell him she was still alive. If she had not been thinking of her brother, she would have noticed he'll shift over to Nigel and whisper something in his ear, which made the man fix his stare on Robert Young. Though her absent mind was totally lost on thoughts of her brother, her conscious mind heard the tolling of the warning bell. She looked around as the sailors, who had until then been relaxed and carefree, rise and become alert at the sound. 4 bells, said one of the men. Does that mean we've got it behind us again? There was mumbling amongst the men, and they shuffled towards the edge of the ship, looking into the darkness. "What have we got behind us, Joe?" asked Cicely quietly, as the man moved with the others. "The Phantom," said Joe. "A ship, behind us almost a month ago, just before we stopped in Sao Paulo. Faster than us and bigger. 1 minute was behind us, and the next, 'twas on top of us." "Ah," said Bondon, who was close to them both in the group, "the Phantom, as bringing us all bad luck, isn't that so, Wally?" The other sailor looked at Bondon, and whispered back, "It's not the ship, Bondon, you know who it is, bringing us bad luck aboard." Just then, Midshipman Donnelly approached the men and addressed them. "We are alerted," he said, as they turned with respect whilst he spoke. "It is likely that you will be asked to join your pair on duty shortly." "It's him." An undisguised whisper emanated from the back of the crowd once the officer had departed. "He's done it again." "Who? Done what?" thought Cicely, and the crowd parted. In the center of the group stood Nigel. "Old Joe," he said, having gained the crowd's attention, "you told us all this evening that you have never had such misfortune. We had our men dying of illnesses as we crossed the Capricorn, the Acheron finding us now. Don't you see, that's another of his doings?" The men continued to talk amongst themselves, nodding in agreement. "What?" asked Cicely to Bondon, who was still standing next to her. "Who does he mean?" "Holem," said Bondon simply. Cicely said nothing. "Edward?" She knew he was not popular amongst the crew. His lack of natural leadership was unfamiliar to them. But this was just superstition. They must know he couldn't be responsible, and that it was just fate. Her heart began to beat faster and she knew what she had to do. Find Edward and tell him she was alive. Tell him she was here and they could make plans to leave. Her mind raced at the thought. How would he react? Here she was going to inform him she was his sister. Cicely took a few steps towards the staircase where the middies would be receiving orders from one of the officers. That was, until she felt a hand on her shoulder. "And just where do you think you're going?" Joseph Nagel tightened his grip as she struggled. "Get off!" she yelled, trying to shake him free. "Bunking off work again, mewling like a kitten to the doctor that the work is too hard. Tell me that isn't why you went looking for the doctor tonight." He turned to P.E., who began to laugh, and she glanced just behind him and saw Heald. "We know of your plans, young, make no mistake," Nigel continued, smarmily. "And I must inform you that Mr. Fillings went without his fruit this evening." He pushed her up against the mast bedding, and she stumbled back. Nigel picked her up bodily, looking over his shoulder and laughing towards his cronies. "How dare you?" Cicely was shocked to hear the words coming from her own mouth. The indignation she had felt for his bullying ways had been tipped when she had heard him speak of her beloved Edward, and she could feel anger welling in the pit of her stomach. Nigel turned back and stared at her. Then she saw him raise a fist, bringing his arm back. All at once the anger overcame her. Cicely had never hit anyone in her life, well not counting a young man into whom she had naively put her trust in London, and even then, it was no more than a slap. Now, she raised her right arm, and swung it back, without thinking, or rather thinking how this would solve her rising anger and frustration with the situation, of her miserable condition made worse because of him and his lies stemming from his own disrespect of Edward. She wanted to make Joseph Nagel sit up and take notice. As he reeled back from his own failed blow, hand flailing in the air, her arm struck his collarbone, and he went flying backwards. She looked at the man, now on his back, and she stepped aside towards the hatch, realizing that every man of the crew were around them, looking between her and Nigel. Nigel opened his eyes and stared at her, a trickle of blood running from his forehead which he dabbed at quickly as he got to his feet. Her blood ran cold. She had hit him. What was he going to do now? stand aside here." Lieutenant Pullings spoke loudly to the men as he analyzed the situation. He looked at Cicely and she felt two hands on her shoulders. "Robert Young, you are hereby under arrest for assaulting a sailor in His Majesty's Royal Navy. 88,888,888. Young, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Captain Aubrey sat behind his desk in his cabin, flicking his quill pen as he sat behind his leather-top desk. Cicely shifted between her feet and looked down. She was guilty of the crime, whatever anyone had to say about it. She had lost her temper when she was about to be attacked herself, and took out her frustrations in an ill-timed jab. Cicely continued to hang her head. She had not slept last night since she was taken to the dungeon cell in the very bowels of the ship by Pullings and the 2 Royal Marines, who had manhandled her into manacles. She felt embarrassed at being brought to the captain of all people, and being present before him in his own cabin still filthy and dishevelled and angrier now with herself than she had ever been at Nigel for allowing herself to be brought to his attention. And then she stammered, still looking down. Aubrey got up from behind his chair. Cicely refused to lift her gaze from the floor. When she was told he had requested to see her, this did not surprise her. The type of captain he was showed that he was fully involved with his crew, and did not delegate responsibility to his lieutenants, as many other captains did. Perhaps this was the reason he was so well loved. "I understand from Lieutenant Pullings that you did not resist arrest." He walked over to her and raised her face so he was eye level to her, and Cicely glanced at the lieutenant who had retrieved her this morning and brought her to see the captain, his face expressionless and remote. "That's better," he said in more gentle a tone. "Now, I don't believe from what I have seen of you so far, Young, that you would deliberately attack a messmate. Nor were you drunk because as I understand it from Dr. Maturin you are of an intolerant religion." Cicely nodded, but still said nothing. She had decided that, following the possible sighting of the Acre on the previous night, and now her situation, to reveal herself to Edward would be unwise. Indeed it would seem that many aboard agreed with Nigel, and if they were to know she was a woman, their suspicions would be confirmed. He would be blamed for the ill luck because of her, his sister's presence. Therefore for her plan to work, she still needed Robert Young. Whatever punishment he decides, she thought, I will take. Coughed Aubrey, walking over to Pullings. "Did you say in fact that you saw Young strike Joseph Nigel, or was he on the deck when you saw him?" Pullings glanced at Cicely. "He was on the deck," said the lieutenant. "However, 2 of the men notified the Marines of the incident, and they notified me." "I see," said the captain, looking Cicely up and down. "Indeed. This is a very sorry business, Young. I've been assessing your skills and ability as a minlet, and believe you to be most capable. I would ask Lieutenant Pullings," he gestured towards Cicely, and Pullings strode towards Cicely, "to escort you outside. I need to decide on the most appropriate punishment. You understand that such a crime usually fetches a lashing?" Cicely looked up sharply, trying to hide her look of alarm. If that were to happen, her secret would of course be discovered. Pullings took her by the shoulder and turned her round, opening the door to escort her out. "Ah, Stephen," said Aubrey, as Cicely stepped aside for the doctor to pass. "Do come in." The doctor glanced at Cicely, and she looked briefly into his eyes, pale green bounded by black lashes. Pullings shut the door behind them. "Wait there," he said firmly, and walked away. Cicely stood with her head down. There was no doubt about it, her beloved brother's reputation would be ruined because of her hot-headedness. Perhaps it would have been better to have married William Howard, First Lord of Cambridge, that big oaf of a man, and have her spirit crushed than to have to endure Edward's sorrow. Young. She looked up. Edward was standing before her, his beautiful features outlined by the shadows of the morning sun. Why was he here? Why did he torment her so? Cicely tried not to look at him, as was the custom, and saluted him, before looking down. "Do you know how close you are to your dear sister, Edward?" she thought, concentrating on a knothole just by her right foot. "You are pained because you thought I'd died. But I didn't. I'm here. I have just spoken to Fillings," he said, his voice softening, as if trying to break good news gently to a young child. "He has informed me as to the extent of the situation of—" He stopped. Voices were raised in the cabin. "And this is common practice, Jack. I do not believe that any service should condone any treatment of Dash. Mistake to have brought him aboard. He is far weaker than any I have had in the service." Edward glanced at Cicely, before knocking on the cabin door. "What? Yes?" the captain yelled irritably through the door. "Who is it?" If you please, sir," said Edward. "Midshipman Holum, sir." There was a scraping of a chair across wood and some shuffling. "Come, Holum." Cicely watched out of the corner of her eye as her brother went in, and closed the door behind him before dropping her head back to the knothole. A couple of minutes later the door opened again. The doctor opened it, and looked at Cicely. "The captain would like to see you now, young," he said, holding open the door, and he closed it behind him after she walked in. Edward was standing by the table, and the captain behind it. "Before I say anything regarding your punishment, young, Mr. Holum has brought to my attention a serious issue, something to which I have to admit I have not noticed. Is it true that men aboard this ship have been taking yours and others' rations?" Cicely looked at Edward. "James," she thought, "you fool. Those men you have betrayed will never let you rest for this." She looked at the captain and nodded. The doctor let out a hmph of indignation. The captain looked at him, and then back at Cicely. "This does somewhat color the water, young," he said, stepping over towards the doctor. "You are dismissed, Mr. Holum," he added, and Edward saluted, before pacing over the plank-soaked planks. The captain stared at Cicely for a moment, before getting up from behind his desk. "You have endured this for how long?" This time, it was the doctor who spoke to her. She turned to look at him. If you please, sir," she stammered, "Cicely Holum now, not just the dim-witted Robert Young she was pretending to be." "For 3 weeks, sir." "And did they take all your food every sitting?" The captain looked at the doctor. Cicely paused. Not at first, sir. They took my fruit. The limes. Then they would take all of it, sir." She looked at Aubrey. "However, this does not excuse your crime, young," he said sternly. I will take the punishment, sir," she said meekly, dropping her head and biting her tongue hard. She longed to tell the captain he was wrong about Edward, and that to allow such shaping up as she had endured to pass blindly was a failing on his part. The captain stood up. "There will be none this time, save your making up your hours lost to us through your imprisonment today. Let this is your warning, young. You have sailed close to the wind, and I believe you were provoked enough by this. I guarantee this ceases now. Every man's ration is his own. Please take the time you need to become ship-shape, but remember, it is added to your work time. I will see to it that Mr. Mowat is informed of this." "Stephen," he said, addressing the doctor, "would you be good enough to find Pullings? I would be grateful if we were to continue early or our conversation at another time. Oh, and could you ensure that you would examine Young, for signs of malnutrition? I will organize other men to be sent along once I know which have been deprived of their ration also." "Oh, Young," said the captain, chuckling a little as if for his own amusement, "you may be still young, but on a ship's diet, I expect to see you now grow into a fine strapping example of a man." 88,888,888. "I do not feel unwell, sir," she said for the time since Dr. Maturin began his examination of her for signs of malnutrition. "Tired. Sometimes." "On the contrary, Young, you do not appear to be growing as expected. You are what, 15? She nodded. Yet on service rations, on your old ship, you should be at least stronger and bigger now. She looked at the doctor, who narrowed his eyes in that same analytical way he had done before after her toughening up by Nigel 3 weeks ago. You are? He held out the string that he had got her to stand on just now, next to a measure stick, 5 feet 4 inches. Chest. He held his arms out horizontally, indicating that Cicely should do the same, then looped the string found her back, meeting it at her front. 28 inches. He picked up a pencil, and on the page with the crew details on, where Cicely had copied George Taylor's details into her own. He wrote down her height and chest, glancing back at the entry. He said, shaking his head. This doesn't seem quite right. However, he said, looking at her closely, you'll be as right as rain before the week is out, mark my words. And to his word, she was. Cicely went back to her duties, hard and long toil that day, and that evening, she was welcomed back amongst her crewmates as one of them. Bondon slapped her on the back that night, telling her he would have done the same thing, and even Nigel bobbed his head when she joined them. It would seem that as the captain's word was law, and he had seen fit not to punish her, then she was one of them again. Yes, she thought that evening, as the wind turned chillier and the gloom drew in. Camaraderie is necessary here. They were about to round the Horn before they took on supplies, and even if they got to the South Seas in one piece, it would take a lot of all their strength. 88,888,888. Cicely could see James Fillings near the top of the mast. She could not reach him, but she was damned sure she was going to be the one to get him down. Young. She could hear Blakeney shouting at her to come down, but she feverishly battled on up, as the ropes dug into her hands. Young. Come down at once. Otherwise you'll both be killed. Cicely looked down at the men below her. She had come to begin her pair change, but James had not been at morning mess. She had been halfway through her biscuit and fruit, when she heard shouting, and a crack of splintering wood. Running onto the deck, she had seen disorder. Men were running hither and thither, calling for more men, pointing and shouting. It appeared as if the top arm of the mainsail mast had come loose, waving the sail loose from its sheet. "Are all free?" shouted Midshipman Calumet, rushing underneath the sheet, and looking between the mastheads. "Mr. Blakeney, if you please." Cicely hurried over to Chell, who had also been on the night watch. What happened? She looked around at the men. The mast, it just. He stopped as another crack brought down a piece of wood. Sailors scattered, just in time as it hit the deck with a huge thud. More crew appeared now. Fillings. She heard someone yell. "He's still up there." Cicely hurried to, and saw her friend in danger. He was hanging by his leg, the mainsail sheet wrapped around it. 50 feet up. "James?" she yelled herself. James. He was not moving. The mast hit him, someone shouted. The rest of the middies gathered round Calumet. Lamb approached Blakeney, and whispered something. "We must get him down," said Edward, looking around. "We must." Cicely looked at him quickly, then back at James and gasped. The second half of the cross-mast was moving now, as if threatening to join the first half. If that happened, James would go with it. Taking to her station side of the ship, she got onto the middle sheet and began to climb, catching the ropes above her and pulling herself up feverishly. "No." She heard someone shout. "Don't be foolish, Holem. Look at the mast. If someone goes up, they'll both be killed." "But we can't just leave him," she heard Edward shout. "We can't lose another man. Not after all the misfortune and bad luck the ship had been subjected to in this last week." She looked up at the mast through the haze of the baking sun. Cicely and James were the lightest crew members, so out of all of them, she was his best chance. Hurrying underneath the masthead, she glanced at James, hanging limp between the sheets. She would not let her friend die, and she would have her brother know that someone respected his opinion. Using all the effort she had, she began to scale the ropes. Young. She heard Blakeney yell. "No, stop where you are, come back." Cicely stopped, looked down to a sea of faces so far down. She climbed the mainsail once a day, but only to check the line end, and then, say was the slowest up and down. Above her she heard the wood-bound creak and looked back at James. She could see his face, pale and small, with some blood leaking from his temple, and at the back. How could this have happened? The carpenter had just this week replaced it, after William Wally was lost in the Straits of Magellan, and he had been doing the job 30 years. There was no reason for it to break like that, especially in the becalmed seas they had been experiencing. Without looking down she continued to climb, before stopping just underneath him, holding on. "What's he think he's doing?" exclaimed Pullings to Calumet, before striding over to Aubrey. "He just climbed the sheets, sir." The captain marched over to the debris, looking up. Young. Cicely looked down. If he told her to come down, she would not disobey a direct order. But she prayed that Aubrey would show himself the true leader he was by allowing her to get him. Aubrey said nothing for a moment, and assessed the situation. "That damned fool boy. Mowat," he said to his sailing master. "Round the men up, will you? I am not going to lose another man so soon after young Wally. We need to move this cross-mast and sever the line." He looked back up at Cicely, who was beginning to tie James's clothing round her own, to secure him. "James," whispered Cicely, up in the sheets to the unconscious boy. "It's Robert. When I get you down, the doctor can take a look at your head." She took hold of the rope, and pulled it to one side, to release his leg. She gripped him round his waist, draping his floppy limbs round her neck and interlinking his fingers. But the sheet hadn't moved completely, and it was still attached round his foot. Worse still, she could hear the wood around her bend and creak in the cold wind. Without looking down, she unlocked his fingers. He was still attached to her clothing, but Cicely could climb a bit higher to release his foot. "Young," yelled Aubrey, "we're going to shift the other half. Then his leg will be free. Do you understand?" She looked down and tried to nod. Cicely hoped they could see her, as she held on to James. 1, 2, 3. Heave. She heard Mowat shout at the sailors below. The mast moved to one side, and the sheet round James's foot was released. This meant she could now clamp his fingers together round her neck. 1, 2, 3. Heave. She heard from below again, and the sheet was pulled straight, so James's poor unconscious frame was free to hang on hers. "Ah!" she yelled, as the sheet slipped between her fingers. This second tug had maneuvered his body too vertical, and as such, its mass hung round her neck, causing her to lose hold. Cicely desperately gripped onto the sheets she could reach, but had fallen 10 feet until she could regain her grip. She heard a gasp beneath her. Young, she could hear the captain talking to her. Cicely swing herself round so she could face him. "Can you see the loose line below you?" She nodded. "I want you to grab it," he said, "and we'll pull you down." Cicely breathed. The adrenaline of the excursion going up to get James was beginning to wear off, and suddenly 35 feet to the hard-planked deck seemed a very long way. She didn't move. "Young," shouted the captain again. "Do as I say. It is just to your right." Cicely looked across at the ocean now, into the glare of the dazzling hot sun. If she moved, she knew, they would both be killed. "Robert Young?" Cicely's heart began to pound as the soft, gentle voice blaned through the hot air. She recognized it. It was the same calm voice which had encouraged her down from a tree in their back garden when she was 8 years old. the same cool manner telling her their mother had died. "Robert Young, there is a line to your right. Take it with your right hand, and keep grips of Mr. Fillings with your left." She heard muttering from below. "Do as Mr. Holmes says, Young," shouted the captain. "Yes," she thought. "It's just there. All I need to do is catch it." She shifted her weight to her right-hand side. "This is going to hurt," she thought. She took the sheet and wrapped it round her wrist. The more grip she could get, the better. Then she placed her left hand on James's back, letting go of the sheet on the left. She closed her eyes. This was it, she thought. Either they both lived, or they both died. The rope in her right hand shifted them both away from the center of the mast. At the same time as they swung pendulously towards the furthest point on their trajectory, the second half of the mast came down, impacting on the first with a thud. If Fillings was left up there on his own, he would have come down with it and been crushed to death. Cicely yelled with the pain. Despite James being a small lad, her arm was in agony as she held on for dear life. She looked down and could see crew members scurrying round the debris again, this time, following orders the midshipmen were giving them, but that she couldn't hear. They lurched into the space where the cross-mast had been, and became entangled momentarily in the sheets that had come chaotically apart. "Young. Can you hear me?" She heard the bosun shouting below. She refused to look down. Any moment now and she would lose her grip. They would both be going to the deck. James, she thought, looking at the brown mop of hair in front of her, matted with blood and wood chippings. She looked down, and saw the deck coming towards them both. "Hang in there, lad." The speed she was falling was slow and regimented, but she could feel the rope slip in her right hand. She screamed, trying desperately to wrap her leg round the rope to prevent them from falling. If she could just hang on, then they would be safe. 10 feet from the deck, and her grip finally gave way. James landed on top of her, as she thumped onto the tangle of mainsail below. Men gathered round her, untangling the ropes round her hand and leg. She looked at the bright sunlight, and her head began to ache. "Stand aside." She heard the matron say, and the men shuffled back from her. He rolled James off her, and looked into her eyes. She blinked, eyes fuzzy, and tried to focus on his. She coughed, before staring at the doctor in alarm. He was feeling down her sides and legs. Then he felt her arms firmly before pulling her forward. She slumped into a sitting position. "No broken bones, Jack," he said, turning back to the captain, who stood just behind him. "Just be careful of your head today, Young," he added, looking at her forehead. "James," she said hoarsely, looking at Fillings. "He's still alive," she said, trying to divert the attention to him. "I could feel his heart beating just now." Maturin crossed over to James, and tore open his jerkin and shirt, examining his ribs. Cicely glanced across, and began to get up. Chell held out an arm to help her. She sighed, nodding in gratitude, as she got to her feet. "He's still alive," she continued, looking at James Fillings. "As are you," said her brother, next to her ear. "Well done, Young," he added, giving her a smile. She glowed, and 1 or 2 salts came across to pat her on the back, causing her to stagger slightly. "Well done." The captain crossed the deck, and looked keenly at Cicely. "Well done," he repeated. "You disobeyed orders from a superior, Young, and as such, should be severely reprimanded. HMPH. He added, looking across to the scene where Stephen Maturin, with the help of John Ball, was carrying an unconscious Fillings down to the lower decks. "As it is, you saved his life, and since the straits, I need all the souls we can get against this hellish misfortune that has ailed us. HMPH. He snorted, before leaving Cicely standing on the deck. "3 cheers for Young," shouted Chell, to the sailors around them. "Hip hip! Hog it!" shouted the captain to the top decksman, interrupting the cheers from the salts. "Salvage all that you can, and make as good as repair as you can for now, will you? It's not as if we are going anywhere that our mast must be oak stable." "All back to work!" shouted Hoggett, and the midshipman sparked back into life, cajoling the men into work. "And you lazy lot," he yelled at some of the men leaning against the deck railings. "I rather think it was he who saved my life," thought Cicely. "He's alive now, and if he hadn't told Edward about Nigel, I would have been discovered." She felt a little glow of happiness inside her as she stooped. As she staggered, her head did seem a little light, and the fierce 11 o'clock sun wasn't helping matters. Feeling her knees give way under her and the deck meet her body again for the second time that day, she passed out. 88,888,888. Sound, on the very tip of her consciousness, filtered through into Cicely's mind. She lay where she was, resting, and tried to work out what it was. "The doctor doesn't think the captain ought to do it. I know we all hate Holum, but he failed to salute him. No matter how much you hate a superior, you gotta salute. You just get back to him, over there." Light now filtered into her eyes. Cicely blinked, wondering where she was. Hello. She recognized where she was, on the second deck, just above the sailors' berths. The shape of the planks told her that they were thinner than those further down, and chinks of light from above told her that the Mendic was just above. Robert. Into her view came James, grinning. "You're awake. Thank heavens." "James," she gasped, her chest aching. "You right?" "Yep, thanks to you, Rob," he said, punching her playfully on the shoulder. "The doctor said my head'll heal in a while." He pointed to his forehead. "And now you're back with us, maybe we'll be out of the doldrums." Cicely coughed, trying to raise herself up in the hammock. "Did I hear something about Nigel and Holum?" she asked quietly, trying to sound casual. "Refused to salute," said James, with sensation. "Can you believe it? Not saluting an officer. Well, it's no wonder the captain's thinking of flogging him. Bondon and Harris were just here telling me. Nigel didn't salute." She swallowed. God, what's been happening, she thought. "Well, it's no wonder the captain wants to thrash him," she added loyally. "When was that? It's a wonder he had time, what with the mast." She coughed, before continuing. James thumped her on the back. "The mast?" he said, then laughed. "That was 3 days ago, Rob. It's all been repaired now, and a sail, not like there's much wind to fill it." "But lashes for not saluting," James continued. "I mean, it's like he said, isn't it? He's the bad luck." There was a cough behind them. "I do believe, Fillings, I asked you to remain in bed until this evening." The warm tones of the doctor filled the berth as he strode over to Cicely. Robert said nothing, but scuttled back to his own low-slung hammock. "Young," he said, leaning over her. "Glad to see you are in the land of the living. You gave us all quite a start, Young," he said, looking at her throat and ears. "You have earned the grave disappointment of the captain," he said, looking her up and down, "though I must say I think bravery alone saved your friend. And I am not alone," he continued. "I had to all but bar the door to prevent them coming to see you." He smiled. "How are you feeling?" She swallowed and coughed. "I think you may have caused some damage in here." He looked at her stomach. "This may explain your growth, or lack of it," he added. "However, that is likely the reason you managed to get away with your brave but impetuous stunt. If there are any internal injuries, then you may be here for some time." He began to push up her jerkin near her stomach. "No," thought Cicely, freezing at his touch. "Say something." If you please, sir," she said, with as much force as she could manage. "It's just my head, she said, pointing to her head, and near her neck and hoping her lie would sound convincing. "It only hurts here." "I see," said the doctor, touching her neck again. "In that case," he pulled up a blanket from underneath her hammock. "You need to remain here for the rest of the day, without moving. You may have some problems with your back, and if you move it sharply it may make it worse. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," she said quietly. Stephen Matrin turned to go, nodding at James as he went, to indicate he should also remain where he was. "Sir?" she asked, to his retreating back. "Is it true? Did Nigel not salute Mr. Holm? Is he the cause of our bad luck?" The doctor stopped, hand on latch, before turning to address Cicely. "I believe we make our own luck, young," he said, smiling a little in her direction. "No man can cause bad luck, however there are consequences for actions done. Now, as I say, not one muscle, young." There, though, as she lay there in the darkness, Edward could no more cause them to be windless than any other person. She glanced to one side. "Do you believe it?" she said to James, who was standing near her again, grinning. "Is this bad luck? Can't it just be chance? We're in the doldrums for a reason, Robert. Something's caused it, and it's delaying the captain in finding the Phantom, to destroy her. You know the Bible as I do. I know you're not non-con, but you know the story of Jonah. Anyway, whoever it is, they know they're the one who's done the wrong thing. It'll be someone, the wickedest person on the ship. And that person shouldn't be here." He whacked her on the shoulder again, before Cicely heard the fibers in the hammock creak as he got back on it. Cicely nodded slowly, before staring back at the planks above her. Though she cared little of the captain's plans, her heart agreed with James. Someone was causing it. A Jonah on the Surprise. The wickedest person on the ship. The person who shouldn't be there. Over the rest of the week she watched as the captain held rein over the whole affair, issuing drought orders to preserve their water supply, the men, along with James and herself, grow increasingly filthy. Nigel had been flogged, which caused the men to harbor a growing hatred and insubordination for Edward, not in action, but in thought. It was one mealtime when Cicely looked at her crewmates, eating the meager rations and growing increasingly restless and agitated. She realized with a sense of relief and growing dread that the Salts had got it wrong. It wasn't her beloved brother who was the Jonah, it was her. 88,888,888. The night after the Phantom was seen again, and the days that followed were two that Cicely would never forget, even when she was an old woman, nursing her grandchildren. She could still recall the moonlit sky that illuminated the deck, the smell of the ocean, and the unnerving calmness. Cicely had been declared fit to work almost a week ago, and the captain had continued making preparations for war with the Acheron that they had begun following their successful sailing round Tierra del Fuego, and following their sighting the previous night. The men had been drilled for the action, through artillery, and practice quarters and motions to battle. Though she knew she would have the strength and will to fight the French, she couldn't help wondering whether the captain was merely continuing in order to boost morale, for it was not possible for the Acheron to be sailing, if the Surprise had no wind. Then neither had she. But just the mention of her possibly being there, called out by Calumet the previous evening, was enough to terrify the men, and continue their talk of the Jonah aboard. As she worked her duties and drills, only two thoughts were on her mind: to remain as inconspicuous as possible from now on, and what she could do to let Edward know she was there. Once she could tell him, she told herself, the curse would be lifted and the bad luck she had brought to the Surprise would disappear. That evening, they had eaten a pathetic brown sludge, and James had been sick, undoing Chell's work that day of cleaning the outside of the ship. Cicely had rubbed his back, feeling guilt slowly fill her that it was her presence that had caused her friend to be ill. Even later, Edward had run through the crowd of men on the lower deck, sweating profusely, before rushing back above decks. On recalling the scene years later, Cicely had always wanted, in her mind's eye, to have rushed forward, and tell the whole of the crew, that they had the wrong man, so to speak, and they should be punishing her for their misfortune, not him. But James had held her back from going, wondering aloud where it was she was intending to go, and this had made Cicely's plan of revealing her identity to her brother that night evaporate in her mind. Minutes later she heard the news that he had gone to the doctor and telling him he was ill. I can't tell him now, she thought, mind thinking deeply as James dragged her off in the direction of the berths before returning to carry out the duties as her pair. Tomorrow, she decided finally, following the rest of the men down to the lower deck. It'll be tomorrow. They had been asleep when default of 4 was rung, and the captain called the men to deck. He was wearing a black cloth covering his collar, and the doctor, far from his usual dressing gown attire that she was used to seeing him in when he appeared at odd hours, was dressed formally. First and second lieutenants stood to the left of the captain, middies to the right. Silence reigned as they stood there. For such a long time, maybe an hour or more it had seemed to Cicely, and she scanned the faces as best she could form her proximal position. The first thing she noticed was Midshipman Blakeney. His skin shimmered in the moonlight, as if ghostly, like he was in shock. It wasn't until some time later that she realized Edward was not present. As if a dream played out, the captain recalled the incident to them all, that Holm had taken his own life and it was being investigated. The words didn't register to her, not until the crew were eased of the formality of rank and began to return to their berths. That was when she heard Nigel. Even to her last days, when she recounted the story to her youngest grandchild, when he asked her what Nigel had said, she could never remember exactly. But it was abhorrent enough for her to take hold of her hammock, throwing it in his direction with such force that when it bounced off his shoulder it knocked the oil burner from its hook, causing it to smash noisily onto the floor. Again, she could never remember exactly what she had said, but she had lunged at him, her dumbfoundedness turning quickly to rage and anger. Whether she actually intended to kill him, she would never be sure, but one thing she did know. He was the cause of the only person in her life, her reason for following the life she had done for almost a year, the cause of Edward's death. In the confusion that followed, men around her began to yell. She could hear James beg her to stop, the men around her restraining her when they realized how violently she was assaulting Nigel. After his initial surprise, he hit her back, making her fly across the berth, so Cicely landed with a thump against the wall. When she got to her feet she lunged again, feeling blood on her face now where Nigel had landed a few accurate blows. She did not feel the pain as he retaliated now, matching her blow for blow as the men stood around, aghast. Nor did she recognize the officers that eventually restrained her, carrying her by the arms out of the lower cabin to the top. It was only when she felt the cold night air on her face that she began to slowly stop struggling and lashing out, and anger replaced by bitter sobs. Neither did she hear the officers arrest her again before throwing her manacled into the keep, slamming the double oak doors onto her crumpled form. No one heard Cicely Holm as she threw her sorrow and pain from her body, and as dawn broke over the Pacific Ocean and the Surprise, her tears continued, wild and erratic, until she was asleep. 88,888,888. I've set him to work on the ropes, Stephen, and to be quite frank I really do not know what to do. Jack Aubrey paced across his cabin, addressing his friend who sat calmly in a Queen Anne chair near the door. I ask you, in the keep, 3 days, refusing food now, not speaking. I should just have him out of it and flog him, before throwing him back into work. Huffing as he sat back down behind his desk, he slammed his fist in frustration onto the thick oak table, causing his silver letter knife to leap 6 inches into the air before embedding itself into the wood. Damn! He cursed, looking at it, before looking at Maturin. And I don't know why you're so placid, it's caused you some work, has it not? delayed you from your naturalistic pursuits. Maturin looked across at his friend. He had sympathy for Jack, his friend at his most agitated because he was unable to understand why his crew, who adored his skill and talent as their master, would behave in a manner which he had not considered. His friend, Fillings, Maturin spoke carefully and deliberately. Not even he, for whom Young risked his life, has been able to coax a word. He swallowed, and sat forward in the chair. There is something other than the happenings aboard the Surprise that made him act in this manner. Jack got to his feet quickly, glaring at Stephen, before striding towards the door, pulling it open, and calling for Pullings. "I'll have Blakeney inform him. He's Young's middy, after all. That should get the lad talking, if nothing else." Now it was Stephen's turn to get to his feet. "You can't be serious." He looked at Jack in alarm, placing a hand on his collar. Jack looked at it, and then at his friend, questioningly. "The lad is still recovering from his injuries. As is Nigel. Don't you want to get to the bottom of it first?"